All right. Looks like sound is going. Here we are again. All right. So for this, we're going to talk about homicide, this recording. Um, the first thing I want to talk about are some of the definitional issues. The two biggest being, well, actually, I guess you could divide it into three, but I'd say two. The life and death, the definitions of life and death, and of another life. So, whenever we talk about those are going to fit pretty well in with the discussion that I set up for this week. So first and foremost of that being the political issue of abortion. I have a rather long video on abortion that I'm going to post out for those who responded to that threads to have access to it. Basically, what we start talking about is, the different lines that are drawn for life. Now, you can find this in the way that different states cut off different times. After so many weeks, determine the child is alive. Here in the state of Oklahoma, the unborn is just classified as living. So you have that as it's there's a lot going on in terms of abortion laws. Probably the biggest thing is the upcoming, I guess you say theoretical, was leaked Supreme Court decision that's going to basically return that decision to the states rather than become a federal issue. And once that happens, this state and several others basically will make that procedure illegal. Talk about that pretty quickly from a personal standpoint, just because for some reason it seemed necessary to put it out there. I'm a middle of the road kind of person that it should be legal, but also exceedingly rare and only for very specific purposes. Whenever you see the video I share with you all, you'll kind of see what I mean by that, and the fact that that there has in the last few years been instances where people are no longer for the choice, it's they're for making that specific decision and that becoming a normal decision or a method of contraception. It's like that's you've taken the purpose of that and you've corrupted it to some degree, because it's got its specific purpose and but at the same time what they're doing is something different. Now, the life of another. I just really can't sometimes ducking out of screen. So I'm stuck in my tooth. In terms of abortion, you have that separation. Well, you have the inability to separate those two lives, that one is dependent on the other. And that's why some places will look at the data viability. That video will go into that, as well as some of the issues related to that. Some of the classic lines that people draw, is that first breath or development of a heart or neural tube development is probably one of the better ones. And because at that point in time, you're talking about a child that doesn't resemble a child. You're talking about the inability to feel pain kind of thing. So that's more towards the overlap between the life of another. So when we talk about life and death, when does death actually take place? When are you living? Have you taken that first breath, or have you developed those kinds of things? And when are you no longer living? At that time, that are you no longer breathing? Do you no longer have a heartbeat, or are you brain dead? Are probably the three biggest areas that are open for discussion. Realize that's kind of a hard line to draw. That basically what you're talking about there is, consider someone who's on life support. They're no longer breathing on their own. If you turn that off, and that's sometimes a choice that's presented depending on the scenario, is that homicide? It's like, or would someone classify that person as already deceased? It's like, well, you're talking about that most would probably classify it as homicide, but it's one of those that's, not criminalized in that fashion. Kind of give that as a different example. If you think about people back in the time of polio, you have people. I want to say there's still one person alive today in the United States who's in an iron lung. Basically, if you're not familiar with what those are, almost like a bed chamber around from the neck down that changes the pressure differential to cause a person to breathe because they don't have that control themselves. Is that person alive? Yes, you can talk to them, that kind of thing. Heartbeat, it's fairly straightforward. Person's not, doesn't have a heartbeat. Can you resuscitate them? That kind of thing. There's a little bit of discussion on that. For example, if you start talking about surgeries, how slow of a heartbeat are we talking about? Are we talking about, again, the life support situation where, that's the only thing keeping them going? It's like, that's a decision, that's a point at which, there's some discussion there. Brain dead is probably the one that's most interesting because, well, here, let me show you this. Share screen. All right. What about that? This. Let's see what pops up. There you go. Because what we know about the brain is less than what we know quite a bit, but this is one of those rare exceptions where you start talking about someone's ability and I'll just scroll down. 90% of his brain is missing, and he's still functioning. That's what his MRIs look like. You can see that basically he had hydroencephaly, so water on the brain that destroyed most of his brain over the course of his life. So what you see here is you do have some cognitive issues, but still alive. That is an extreme example of things that can happen and person still be functional. We start talking about brain dead. This person might still be under their own ability, breathing, of course, heartbeat, those types of things, and that's still a decision point at which some people can make have that decision offered to them as to whether or not they'll basically pull the cord, pull the plug. So there are different lines that we can draw and ones that we commonly do, but realize it's not always as straightforward as what it would seem. Causation is one of the next big issues, that someone's act deliberately causes the death. Historically, I have in there that it mentioned the year and a day rule, because medical advancements, I think is what I put in there. That's what's changed that in the last 100 years, because if you shot someone, usually that they would die. Even if it's a relatively mild type of injury, they could die from infection, those types of things. Those things happen relatively quickly. Now there's a lot longer. I mean, probably one of the longest cases, you're talking years. Person, and I couldn't find this case, but one person shot another, caused paralysis, and because of complications due to that paralysis, more than a decade later, that person died. The person had been charged with I want to say it was like aggravated battery, a serious crime, but at that point in time, started facing murder charges. The reason being is because it was a directly related to the injury that was sustained, the problems that were created by that. When you start talking about intervening factors, so long as whatever act a person is taken that causes that death is where that death will be attributed. So it's like negligence. Let's say guy gets shot in the chest, goes to the ER, gets rushed to the operating room, and you have someone who's negligent. It's like will that remove that person's will that negate the murder that had taken place? It's like, is it no longer murder at that point? Is it the result of negligence? That becomes a difficult thing to weigh, because you have to look at how much of a factor that negligence was. Is the death a result of that negligence, or was that death a result of the fact that the original injury? And you can find those things can go either way. So that's a good discussion, like multiple causes. Let's see here. So we start talking about the specific statutes to Oklahoma. I put a number of those into the slideshow. I didn't talk about corpus delicti. Corpus delicti is just Latin for body of the crime. That's basically corroborating evidence, and in murder cases, literally the body is typically what you're talking about, which you don't necessarily have to have. Of course, historically, you'd want to have that. It significantly weaken your case. Now it's not quite like that because technology tracking activities, things like that, that you can establish that someone's deceased, and well, you can verify that they're deceased in a number of ways that you couldn't have back many years ago. Corpus delicti is you can use that for any type of crime, not just murder. So basically, what you're just talking about is proof that the crime has taken place. Maybe I'll talk a little bit more about that whenever I make a video on property crimes, because I think in that section is where I talk a little bit about computer crimes. Because at that point in time, you're not talking about anything tangible. All right. Elements: unlawful act committed by a human being accompanied by mens rea. Act must be the legal cause of the victim's death. Victim must be a living human being. Death must occur within a reasonable period. Those are your basic elements. So where you start seeing the distinctions in the different degrees of murder is typically with intent. So whenever you're talking about murder in the first degree, you're talking about basically premeditated murder that was planned, that was something in advance. The statute itself, I believe, it uses this phrase, malice aforethought. And that's what you're talking about there, aforethought, so earlier planning. Now, as you read through the statutes, you'll see that when they start talking about premeditation or malice aforethought, it's something that can be planned well in advance, or something just in advance of a specific action. I want to say that I have in there where it talks about that it be formed immediately. Let me see if I've got it written down here. Yeah, it can be formed instantly before an act that causes death. So it can be something as simple as you have a hammer in your hand, you decide to pick it up and wield it in a fashion to, murder someone. It's like you're going to crack their head open. You do that, they die. It's like, yeah, that's malice aforethought because you planned that out. Okay. It gives another series of situations in which you'd be falling under murder. It also includes, with regardless of malice, when a person takes the life of another human being for shooting, discharge of a firearm, crossbow, intent to kill. It also has in here about certain specific crimes, let's say forcible rape, robbery, kidnapping, so on and so forth. Anytime that you commit those types of crimes, you're getting murder in the first degree. The basic way to look at that is start looking at the severity of the punishments. I don't think I put that in here. I didn't. So I'll kind of reference Arkansas as a way to kind of clarify that. So some states will identify certain types of crimes that will be almost seen as a penalty enhancement. Like Arkansas, what they had was a capital murder statute. So if you committed any murder in the course of committing a felony, anyone dies, you get a capital murder charge. And the severity of that was you're talking either permanent life in prison without possibility of parole, or the death penalty. Here in this one, you're talking about more serious punishments. And for those specific crimes outlined there. If it's a felony, otherwise, you're talking about second degree murder. Also has in here about drugs and those types of things as well. Second degree, so felony, any other type, was listed there. Here's where it talks about imminently dangerous to another person, evincing a depraved mind. So when you start talking about depraved mind, so acts inherently dangerous to others is what you're talking about here. So the person's taking action that they, could say reckless indifference. Well, I wouldn't say reckless indifference, but you start talking about the level of known danger. The intent there is different than some of your lesser homicide statutes. Okay. Here's where I talk a little about physician-assisted suicide. There are a number of statutes in there about assisting with suicide. basically you're talking about that here in the state of Oklahoma, any form of assisting in suicide is a serious crime. So when you start talking about physician assisted suicide, some places do recognize that and do allow for that. Oklahoma does not. I am anxious to read what people's discussions are on that. Okay, so voluntary manslaughter, we start looking at here as it mentions different types. Heat of passion, domestic relationships. I haven't talked about the reasonable person standard. I should probably talk about that. So one of the big things that you'll see within all of these statutes, and whether you're talking about crimes against person, crimes against property, if you see that term reasonable, a reasonable person standard, what they're talking about there is the average person. For example, all the statutes that are written to a point at which the average person can interpret them, a reasonable person. Anytime you start talking about any standard, it's what the average person would be, not any one particular person, but as a whole, the average would see, a line here kind of thing. And I'll give you some better examples when we move into, I know assault and battery has some good aspects of that, some good discussion on that. You also have the, what was I going to say? Oh, proportionality. Proportionality is another aspect of it. Each decrease in the intent, each decrease in the seriousness is also met by a decrease in the severity of it, the punishments for it. Proportionality is going to be something that you'll see throughout each of the, well, the punishments, and also like exceptions and justifications, those types of things. Heat of passion, basically what you're talking about is extreme emotional situations, those types of things. Say related to domestic relations. There's a whole litany of statutes related to domestic stuff that I have in, I think it's crime against persons section, the in general, not the one on murder. Okay, involuntary manslaughter. Often that's if there's misdemeanor, if it happens in the course of a misdemeanor or negligence. Here it mentions vehicular DUI and failure to act as common ones. So manslaughter in the first degree, Oklahoma statutes. So that's first degree manslaughter if it's in the commission of a misdemeanor. So that's how those go. So certain types of felonies, the serious ones, lesser felonies, and then misdemeanors when you move into manslaughter. So murder in the first, murder in the second, manslaughter. There's sort of a hierarchy there. Okay. When perpetrated without a design to effect death in a heat of passion, but in a cruel and unusual manner, or by means of a dangerous weapons. Okay. Unless they're committed under circumstances that constitute excusable or justifiable homicide. When we get to those sections, I'll talk a little bit more about that because I've got slides in here on that. And that's always a fun, but it's really different talking into a computer, talking into a camera rather than people, because each of these points usually opens up a good healthy discussion of different questions people may have about how these act in real life scenarios. And if you guys have any questions or anything like that, again, I'm only when I can post out supplemental videos pretty easily. Okay. So when perpetrated unnecessarily while resisting an attempt by the person committed to commit a crime, killed to commit a crime. Okay, so under first degree, that third point right there is, let's say you had a justifiable homicide as a defense, and if it fails, that's where you come in under manslaughter in the first degree. When perpetrated unnecessarily, either while resisting an attempt by the person killed to commit a crime. So that's where, let's say a person breaks in your house, tries to rob you or harm you, and you respond with such force that you kill them, and it's disproportionate to the threat or the danger or the harm associated with that situation. This is where you'd find yourself. Remember that when we come back to justifiable, excusable homicides. Okay, second degree. Here it talks about, where I lose it right here. Every killing of one human being by the act, procurement, culpable negligence of another which under the provisions of this chapter is not murder nor manslaughter in the first degree, nor excusable or justifiable homicide. So it's your catch-all. Right? So anything that's not murder in the first, murder in the second, or manslaughter in the first would fall under manslaughter in the second. Okay. Okay, so here's where we get to excusable and justifiable. So a good way to classify this is excusable, anything that's, well, justifiable homicides are a type of excusable homicide. You've got a justification there. So if you're looking like an overall class, think of it about like animals and mammals. All mammals are animals, but not all animals are mammals. You know, all justifiable homicides are excusable, but not all excusable homicides are justifiable. All right. So for the most part, what the statute speaks to are accidental. You know, accident or misfortune, committed by accident or misfortune by doing a lawful act, lawful means, or in the heat of passion, sudden, sufficient provocation, sudden combat, those types of things where you're not looking at the justifiable, where it would be some type of self-defense, but still, yes, not self-defense, but still something that is proportionate to what was there, just death is incurred. And when we talk about death, you know, another conversation I like to have with students is, you know, the difficulty and the ease at which people die. You know, depending on the situation, depending on the harms rendered, you know, the death can be a very simple thing. I mean, probably the most extreme cases you've probably heard of, or you know, someone falls, hits their head, and you know, that's it. They die, and that happens. I wouldn't say frequently, but it's not infrequent. So if you have one of those situations where, let's say, a person attacks another person, that person fights back, you're talking about in the course of that fight, the aggressor falls over, hits head, dies. You know, it's going to be excusable, not justifiable, because it's not, you know, might not necessarily be self-defense. It's just that would fall under this. Like, that was not the intent, that was not the purpose of it, and it was an accident. Justifiable homicide by officer and justifiable homicide by any persons basically follow pretty closely to one another. You're looking here. This here. So homicide is justifiable committed by any person in the following cases: resisting any attempt to murder the person who's victim, commit a felony upon him, or in the dwelling of the house in which the person is. So if you're in your own home and someone tries to come in and you know, hold you at gunpoint, and you shoot them and they die, it's like that's going to be justifiable. Now, again, so when we talk about proportionate, trying to see if this one had fear in it. Reasonable force, yeah. There's that reasonableness standard. When the person using reasonable force reasonably believes the force is necessary to prevent death or great bodily harm. So when we start talking about these, you know, what constitutes a reasonable fear of great and imminent harm, or a reasonable fear of death? You know, that's the standard that you'd be looking at there to identify whether or not it would fall under justifiable homicide. Is that likelihood of force, or that threat of force? Does that meet that level to where a reasonable person would have that belief? And you know, you can play with all kinds of scenarios where, you know, let's say a guy who's 6'8", 300 pounds kicks in the door and says that he's going to rape you, kind of thing. Whether you're male or female, it doesn't matter. Just for that situation, have that happen. It's like, that is, one, a forcible felony. You know, two, you know, the likelihood for, you know, the fear there for someone of imminent harm, most everyone would find that to be reasonable. Now, if that person, kicks in the door and is, under 5 foot tall and says that and unarmed and that kind of thing, it's like at that point in time, it's like you're not talking the same thing. Responding with that much force and the characteristics of that person, you'd have a much greater difficulty in establishing that you had a reasonable fear for that. Didn't even do that. So I guess that's enough for that one. We'll make this one a short one. And I'll go ahead and talk about physician-assisted suicide now. So probably the most interesting case that I've seen on that was related to Jack Kevorkian. If you're not familiar with that, basically what he would do is he would, people who were terminally ill, he would set up a, I wouldn't say device, but IV basically that was gravity fed. You'd set it up to a person had their arm up. If they put their arm down, poison flow into them and they'd die shortly thereafter. At that point in time, you have that clear cut in the fact that he wasn't the one murdering them, but he was assisting in their suicide. They'd make that conscious choice. That case was particularly interesting because whenever he finally got arrested, the crime that really got him was he recorded himself not doing that standard setup, but actually injecting it into the person. I was always curious about whether or not that was because he didn't want states to, put in statutes that would make, the actions that he was taking specifically illegal. Because at that point where he was operating, they didn't have statutes that spoke to that. For the most part, they have anyway, except for the states that allow for it specifically. So it's something that, when you start weighing the quality of life and a doctor's duty to, you talk about the Hippocratic Oath at first, do no harm. Well, what's the greater harm there? Letting the person who's there suffering from a terminal illness and going to die anyway, letting them suffer or relieving them of that burden is not. It's not an easy conversation to have, but it is one that's important to have. And also knowing that when you look at those statutes, the discussion of mental health and those types of things becomes a paramount issue because it's going to overlap heavily with, whether you're talking terminal illness or just suicide in general. Suicide in general, it's got a very serious overlap there. So I'm really curious to see what everyone's written, so that way I can respond in kind. But with that, I'll cut this one short, and then maybe I'll post out the link to the abortion video for those responding to it. And if any of you watch this and you want access to that as well, because basically what I do is I do a deep dive into it. Start talking about statistics for it, practices, policies, not policies so much, but procedures, how and where and to whom it's done, and some of the historic arguments that have taken place for it, and some of the mischaracterizations in terms of one of its biggest proponents, Margaret Sanger. I think you could say mischaracterization. That I kind of leave that up for everyone to make their own decision. And basically, there's some statements that she makes that make it seem like it may be more racially motivated. It's like, is that what those mean or not? But what you really need to do is look at how it acts and make your own decisions there. Again, if you all have any questions, you want more detail on anything, just let me know, and have a great day.